The Muddy Waters Freethought Society is an organization that provides support and fellowship to free thinkers in the Mid-South and beyond, and seeks the betterment of society through secular humanism, science, logic, reasoning, and rational philosophical discourse. Our activities include a weekly book club, the hosting of educational events, such as the talk you are attending at this moment, and facilitating a group discussion called Women of Freethought. We are actively looking for members and volunteers. Further information about the Muddy Waters Freethought Society can be found at letsthinkfree.org, Facebook, and our meetup page. Today's talk is about Humanistic Judaism. Humanistic Judaism celebrates Jewish life while foregoing the appeals for divine intervention and focusing on human reason and human power as a means for improving the world. Today's speaker is Paul Golin, Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. For nearly 2 decades, Paul has helped Jewish organizations and movements better understand the key trends affecting North American Jewry, including intermarriage, engagement, disaffiliation, and inclusion. Paul's writings have appeared in The Forward, the New York Jewish Week, Tablet, and elsewhere. Paul is the white Ashkenazi half of a Jupanese, a Jewish-Japanese multiracial household. He maintains the Jupanese page on Facebook and tweets sporadically at Paul Golin. Without further ado, I will pass the mic to Mr. Golin.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. And it's an honor to be here with you. And thank you, Muddy Waters Freethought Society, for having me. I figure I would talk to you directly for about maybe 30 minutes total and give us enough to ask questions about and have a good conversation afterwards for as long as you want. So if you have questions when I'm speaking, please write them in the chat if that will help you remember it. We'll have plenty of time to get to it if I don't cover it. And I see some of the folks who have joined us know more about humanistic Judaism than I do, have been involved for longer than I have. So I will try my best not to get anything wrong, but you can correct me if I do afterwards. And I also imagine that there are folks joining us who know very little about humanistic Judaism and maybe even know very little about Judaism. So I'm gonna speak both very broadly and also try to make it as specific as I possibly can as well. So I like to start with numbers. I won't go too deep into numbers, but I want to give a general sense of who it is we're talking about, how many people, and how we know. So you may know, or you may not, Jews make up only 2% of the US population. Did folks know that? And only 0.2% of the global population. So there are about 7 million Jews in the US. There's only about 16 million Jews in the whole world. We get credit for doing a lot more than our numbers would suggest, both from admirers and detractors. But I do think it's fair to say that Jews have a disproportionate influence in many aspects than their numbers. And I'll table that and we can talk about that comments afterwards. But we want to address belief in our conversation today because we are secular people and we're humanistic, and how do we know about that? So the Pew Research Foundation has done 2 surveys of American Jews, one in 2013 and one more recently in 2020. And I think most demographers would agree this is the most authoritative survey of US Jews. And in the 2020 survey, they asked a question that I was so thrilled finally got asked, and asked in this way. They asked Jewish Americans, do you believe in the God of the Bible? And as far as I know, that had never been asked on a survey. And the percentage of US Jews, and this was by all accounts, as representative a survey as you can get with a small population within a much larger population. Only 26% of US Jews said, yes, they believe in the God of the Bible, 26%. Of course, the survey didn't ask, what do you believe is the God of the Bible? I think that those of us who have actually, read the Bible can see many different gods. And of course, in Judaism, God has many names and many different attributes. And so maybe a different survey would be interesting to ask those 26%. Tell us about the God of the Bible. But anyway, 26% of American Jews only. And that is compared to 58% of all Americans who say they believe in the God of the Bible. Pew then asked a follow-up question, which I was also very thankful for. They asked the people who said, no, I don't believe in the God of the Bible. Do you believe in any higher power or spiritual force? And on that follow-up question, 22% said no. So 22% of all Jews, not just of those who were asked the follow-up question. So you had 26% on one end of the spectrum who believe in the God of the Bible. And then you have 22% on the other end of the spectrum who don't believe in the God of the Bible or any other higher power or spiritual force. And that 22% of US Jews compares to 10% of Americans in general who say they don't believe in any God or higher power or spiritual force. And then you've got 50% of American Jews in the middle who said, yes, they do believe in some higher power or spiritual force. Now, here's where Pew did not ask any more follow-up questions. And I wish that they had, because I certainly have follow-up questions to those 50% who don't believe in the God of the Bible, but do believe in something. And my questions to them would be, for example, does that something answer prayers? Does that something interject itself into human affairs, right? I'm guessing, just based on my experience of being a Jewish communal professional for the past 20, almost 25 years, half of those 50%, so like another 25% of US Jews would say that they believe in something, but that something does not impact or interject in human affairs. So in other words, God becomes a synonym or a metaphor for spirituality or nature or all the good in the universe. And so if you combine that, I would estimate 25% of that 50%, like half of that 50%. So 25% of US Jews who believe in something, they don't want to say that they're atheist or agnostic. They believe in something, but that something is like, a life force, right? The force from Star Wars, whatever it is. It doesn't impact their lives. Praying to it may make you feel better, but it's not going to change anything. Combine that with the nearly quarter of American Jews who flat out say, no, don't believe in any gods, don't believe in any higher power. You've got nearly half, if not more than half, of US Jews who are secular, who don't believe, and more than that, the majority of US Jews don't believe in the God of the Bible. And I think this kind of holds for Jews around the globe. We know that certainly the other large population center for Jews, of course, is in Israel. We know that almost half of Israelis are also secular in outlook. So that raises the question of why? Why are so many Jews secular? Why are such a higher percentage of Jews secular in outlook? That's certainly one question it raises. I'll get to some other questions it raises as well. But that question of why are so many Jews secular? I don't know that there are definitive answers, but I think about at least two factors. One is the minority religious experience. So Jews, until they had their own nation beginning in 1948, were always the minority in the countries that they were living in. And what does that do to you when you see the majority, in many cases, the vast majority, espousing a belief with certainty, the way we have so many people in America today who believe with absolute certainty in the existence of God, in the divinity of Jesus, and so on. I think there's a couple of ways to go. One way to go is to, if you know that they're wrong, you can either say to yourself, they're wrong, but I got it right. We know, and they got it wrong. Or what I think is actually a more reasonable and maybe even a more likely response is you say, they're so wrong, but what makes me think that my thing is so right? I think this happens as well for anybody who really educates themselves on global religion. Any exposure to more than one religion inevitably is going to make you question that first religion. I think it's really only those who are, for the most part, isolated and completely reinforced in their singular religion who can so easily and not unquestioningly adhere to it. So I think what happened the moment that secularity became an option, right, which was basically the Enlightenment, before European Enlightenment, you have no choice. Whether you believed in it or not, all of society expected it, so you went along. The moment that there was an Enlightenment in Europe, there was a corresponding Enlightenment in the Jewish community, and Jews who had the means to leave religious Judaism did in large numbers. So secular Jewish identity has existed since the Enlightenment. But the other thing that I would argue accelerated secular Jewish identity was the Holocaust, which I hope I don't need to explain to anybody on this call. But I think that the experience of genocide on a population leaves scars across generations. I'm what is called 3G, and it's not like about your phone reception. There's a group called 3G, third generation Holocaust survivors. My mom was born in a displaced persons camp in Berlin the year after the war because her parents survived the Holocaust. I knew my grandmother, and I know some of what she experienced, and it was horrifying. And the trauma that she experienced was passed on. And there's now scientific research going on about generational trauma and how it's passed even through our DNA in some ways. So the experience of a massive tragedy as a people who had claimed to be chosen by God, right? The chosen people, and then to be ignored by that God, I think put to question so much of the Jewish religion. And again, there's two ways you can go on it. You can double down, and certainly Orthodox Judaism doubled down on it. And as far as the numbers go, and to kind of define these terms, so the Orthodox Jews try to adhere as strictly as they can to religious Jewish law, and they are only 10% of US Jews. So most US Jews are not Orthodox, are not observant of all of the Jewish laws, like keeping kosher, you may have heard of. But I think many in the Orthodox community doubled down on the story and said the Holocaust was God's punishment, right? And frankly, you can hear this from some religious people in other religions as well. They're not gonna give up on this story that there's a God manipulating human experience. And so why would God let this evil happen? The Jews must have done something to bring it on themselves. But from a very young age, when I began to learn what the story of my family was, I don't remember ever believing in a God or the God of the Bible, but certainly I couldn't understand how I was expected to continue to pray to an entity that did nothing when we needed it the most. What was the point to continue doing it when it was proven to me beyond the shadow of a doubt that those prayers were not going to be responded to? So those are some of the reasons why I think secularity is so strong among Jews. But then it raises this other question that we get a lot, which is then why still be Jewish? And what is Jewish, or what does Judaism mean? And I think what's happened a lot in the Jewish community, to the Jewish community by the wider US community or global community is to be seen as a religion, as a religious group. And there are indeed certain times when it is advantageous for Jews to only be seen as a religious group. But that is not accurate. And part of the great challenge that Jews have experienced throughout history is that we don't fit into anybody's neat boxes. We check multiple boxes, and that has been very problematic historically for the Jews. So is it a religion? Of course. But is it only a religion? Definitely not. Judaism is many things. I'll check off some of the things that they are for me. My ethnicity is Ashkenazic Jew. If I did a DNA test, which I'm not going to waste the money on because I know the results are going to be 99.8% Ashkenazi Jewish, maybe the 0.2% would be of interest to me. It's not motivational for me. It doesn't come back as half Polish, half Ukrainian, even though that's where my family traces its ancestry to. And the reason is because my ancestors were never accepted as Poles or Ukrainian. There was almost no intermarriage after a certain amount of time. There was definitely intermarriage at some point early on because I am pasty white, right? Like Poles and Ukrainians. I am not African like the Ethiopian Jewish community is African in physical appearance, right? Jews spread out from the historic lands of Judea, today Israel, Palestine, and went all over the world. And there was a Jewish community in China, and they looked Chinese. That didn't happen because of some chameleon-like attributes that humanity has. That happened because of intermarriage. So there was intermarriage in those initial growth of those communities, but it ended very quickly. And if you know anything about the history of Jews in Eastern Europe, it was that we were forced to live in our own towns and ghettos. The word ghetto originated in Venice, Italy, as the only part of Venice that Jews were allowed to live in. And if you ever go to Venice, there's a great tour you can take of the Jewish ghetto, and it's very interesting. But that word then got applied to cities that had specifically Jewish neighborhoods, not because I want to live near other people that are like me. It was because they had no choice. And that in marriage created, over hundreds of years, created Jewish ethnicity. And Ashkenazic, I say Ashkenazic Judaism because there are multiple Jewish world ethnicities. Mizrahi is the other major one when you go to Israel, which became kind of a melting pot of Jewish ethnicities. Mizrahi were from North Africa, the Arab nations, and had hundreds of years worth of Jewish history. Again, not fully integrated. And so Judaism is an ethnicity, but it's not only an ethnicity because people can convert into Judaism. They can convert religiously, but people marry into Judaism as well. And what does that mean? My wife is from Japan, as you heard in my bio. We have a Japanese household. She did not convert. She doesn't consider herself Jewish. She loves gefilte fish. She eats chopped liver. She doesn't like kashvanishkis. You know, she is a culinary Jew or Jew-adjacent person. There is a culture. There's culinary Judaism. Judaism has been called a civilization by one influential rabbi who founded a movement called Reconstructing Judaism. So when you look at, for example, Yiddish literature or Yiddish culture, this is the Jews in Eastern Europe had their own language. They created their own culture in that language. Shalom Aleichem is the most famous of those writers, and the play and film Fiddler on the Roof was based on one of his short stories. To call what he was doing religion is absurd. In many ways, his stories were anti-religion. It was a culture, and it is a culture, and it remains a culture. I claim Seinfeld as Jewish culture. It was on mainstream TV, sure, but if you're familiar with Jewish culture, Seinfeld is Jewish culture, and so on. So Judaism is also a culture. And other ways to describe it might be as ethno-national, right? There is a Jewish state now called Israel, and that is based on ethno-nationalism. And we have ethno-nationalism in our country, and it's called white Christian nationalism. And both are problematic, and we can address that at the end if we need to as well. And it's a family. And I think family might be the best way to describe it. I mentioned people can marry into it. We don't always like our cousins, right? We have issues with family members, but I think family is another great way to describe Judaism. So we have all of these different ways of describing Judaism. It is not just a religion. And so when Pew does a survey to ask people, are you Jewish? They start off with the question, what is your religion? And if you say Jewish, then you are Jewish by religion, was the category. But they did ask follow-up questions to those who said none or atheist agnostic. And they basically got at, do you have any Jewish heritage? Right? Heritage is another word. And those who said yes were considered Jews not by religion, an actual category of sociology. And so why don't they just say, I'm American, I'm generic white bread America? Some Jews do. I know a handful. Overwhelmingly, they don't. And that raises another question of why still be Jewish if the religion is not tying you to it? And I think there are as many answers for that as there are Jews. I can tell you a peace of mind is the meaning and the connectiveness of being Jewish. I am a white man in America. That brings me unearned privilege, and I don't want it totally, even though I know I benefit from it. Being part of a minority, and at times persecuted minority, at times model minority, especially today with a rise in anti-Semitism that is measurable, makes me feel greater empathy for other minorities. I would like to believe that that increased empathy of being a minority, even though Jews in America are overwhelmingly white racially, allows us to advocate for and stand by other discriminated against minorities. And that is a piece that I want to hold on to, and I want my kids to feel a connection to as well. My kids are not racially white, they're mixed. So this is a piece that I feel connected to through Judaism. And of course, just being connected to something larger than yourself, right? That's something that religious people might claim. As a secular person, I can still claim that I'm connected to something larger than myself, which is my ancestry, my heritage, my peoplehood, right? Folks have used that word for the Jewish community. I feel a connection. At the same time, I'm a universalist and a humanist, and I don't think Jews are the chosen people. And I think that many people have amazing, incredible historic stories, just like the Jews do. But the Jewish story is mine. And so I have been to the Acropolis in Athens. And if you're lucky enough to be able to travel, it's an amazing place. And if you understand Western civilization, you understand how important that place is. And it was amazing to be there. But I've also been to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and it had a different experience for me. And because the experience at the Western Wall was knowing that 2,000 years of my ancestry said words about being there. They turned to that location when they prayed. It was in their minds for 2,000 years. And yet I was only the second generation in my family, as far as I'm aware, for thousands of years who was able to stand there. And that was powerful and that was impactful. And it doesn't mean it's better than the Acropolis, but it was more emotionally powerful for me because of that connection. So those are the kind of things I'm looking for, as well as the marking of time with holiday celebrations and life cycle events. All of these reasons are why Humanistic Judaism was founded. So let me talk now a little bit about how this leads into Humanistic Judaism, which is admittedly still the smallest denomination in American Jewry, because I do think that while a lot of secular Jews remain Jewish culturally and ethnically and identity-wise, most of them do not participate in ritual. They may do holiday celebrations that are home-based, like Hanukkah, lighting a menorah, or Passover, having a Passover Seder, a ritual meal, but that's about it. And as far as the communal aspect of it, communal ritual, other holiday celebrations like the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, is not something that they really go for anymore. And in most cases, it's, I think, because it feels like religion. And that's the thing that they're moving away from. And in all honesty, Humanistic Judaism is still religion. It is a non-theistic religion. It does not center a God, and it does not have worship services, but it has rituals. And there are other non-theistic religions out there as well. You may have heard of ethical culture. Universal Unitarian Humanists is a non-theistic religion as well. And the commonality is ritual and liturgy around holidays and life cycle events. And Humanistic Judaism was founded in the mid-60s by a rabbi who was ordained in the Reform movement. So Reform movement today is the largest movement of the Jewish community in America. And it is still theistic. It's very liberal-minded. But their services are still prayer services and have God as every fourth word in the liturgy. And our founding rabbi, Sherwin Wine, was ordained in that movement, could no longer bring himself to keep saying words he didn't believe, was met by a community of families who also felt that way. And together, they decided to create Humanistic Judaism. And the innovation that they brought was to rewrite Jewish liturgy for the holidays, for life cycle events, removing God from the liturgy and replacing it with a humanistic philosophy, making it about the human experience. So now I have to talk about humanism. What is humanism? And this is in some ways harder for me to describe because I don't think there's one clear definition. So I'll give you the way I describe it. The way I describe humanism is that it is a philosophy that does not anticipate divine intervention and instead believes that humans ourselves can determine right from wrong, can use reason and logic and empathy and science and the best of human emotions to discern right from wrong and to create our own ethics and values. So overlaying that on top of the traditional Jewish holidays and life cycle events, Sherwin Wine and this community out in suburban Detroit, which is still there today, it was called the Birmingham Temple. It changed its name recently to the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit. And a movement started because Rabbi Wein would go around the country, and even though he never labeled himself the atheist rabbi, he was publicized as such. And in the 60s, certainly 70s, and even the 80s, that was kind of a radical proposition. People would come out and be excited about what he had to say. And then he would say to some volunteers, okay, now you're going to start a congregation here in Sarasota, Florida. And here's what it's going to be called. And you're a volunteer, and you're going to have high holiday services, and you're going to create a congregation, and so on. And today we have about 26 communities in the US and one in Toronto, and we have independent members from all over the planet. And Society for Humanistic Judaism, which is the organization I am executive director of, is the umbrella organizing platform. We also have a rabbinic ordaining arm, which is a leadership training, so that we ordain rabbis and community leaders through that. That's called the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. And as I said, we're still small. I feel like I've been working at SHJ for a little over 6 years. I feel like the time is right now to really spread the word and let people know that there is an option for Jews to still celebrate being Jewish and connect to the tradition and the teachings that might still hold values, while being open about rejecting this stuff that we don't believe in, never having to say anything that we don't believe in. So while this innovation seems technical, right? We change the words. What the philosophy allows us to do is really quite different than the other Jewish denominations in America. For example, we celebrate interfaith, intercultural marriage. No one in other Jewish, no rabbi certainly in any other Jewish denomination is going to use the word celebrate the way we do. They may welcome it, they may accommodate, they may, etc. But we celebrate it. We feel like there is a wonderful thing about interfaith, intercultural marriage, just as there is about marriage or love, or not if you're not looking for it. We want to recognize that people have the options to do whatever they want. But if they are looking for love and they found it, we want to celebrate it with no strings attached. And the Jewish community historically has been very uptight about interfaith marriage, because the sense was it's a loss for the Jewish community. Jews who intermarry will leave. But that has not really been what's happening once there's an option for Jews to stay connected. But for our movement, we're able to say, not only don't Jews have to leave if they intermarry, but you can incorporate the celebration of your loved ones' cultures too. Because when you approach Judaism as a culture, then it's not a zero-sum game anymore, right? Western religion is at a certain point either or, right? There are pretty hard borders between Judaism and Christianity. And his name is Jesus. And likewise with Christianity and Islam and so on. Those borders don't exist when it's culture, because you can do as much culture as you have time in the day for and as you're interested in, and there's no conflict. I just was in Japan last week with visiting my in-laws, and on New Year's Eve, I went to a temple because that's what they do in Japan on New Year's. And I got to ring my father-in-law paid off the priesthood there, and we got to ring the brass bell once out of 108 times. That's what they do on New Year's for good luck. And I Googled it today because I didn't know. 108 represents how many moral temptations there are in life. I didn't see the full list, but okay. And so on New Year's Eve, they ring the bell at these temples 108 times to represent all the moral temptation that you're hoping to avoid in the coming year. Wonderful. We got to ring the bell once out of the 108. We climbed up the ladder to the bell tower. It was super cool. There was nothing in that for me that was religious. That was completely a cultural act. And I don't feel like I offended my God. I don't feel like I offended their God. I don't think those gods exist. But how can you pull out? Japanese society is just like Judaism in many ways. How can you pull out the cultural from the religious, right? That was happening at a Buddhist temple. It was a Buddhist ritual. There were religious reasons for that ritual. And yet 100 out of the 108 people gonging that bell, I believe, are secular in outlook and don't connect what they were doing to the religious origin of it. Japanese is a very secular society as well, but they simply cannot. And when people ask my wife, what's your religion? She actually says Japanese, right? She doesn't say Buddhist or Shinto because she just can't understand how you would separate it out. And I think Judaism is a lot like that as well. So humanistic Judaism provides one avenue for people who really don't want to say the things that they don't believe to continue doing this. Now, in the Reform movement, there are plenty of secular, even openly atheist Jews who continue to be involved in their religious communities and say those words. And their reasoning is, well, these are the words that my ancestors have said for thousands of years. And I get that. And I don't judge it, because if it's meaningful, do it. If it's meaningful and doesn't hurt anybody else, do it, right? So what we're just trying to do is add this additional layer of meaning for folks who also want to be able to openly say, and I'm secular, and I don't believe in God, and I'm still Jewish and comfortable in all of those identities and celebrating all of those identities. Another example is our embrace of LGBTQ identity and community: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. Overwhelmingly, Jews in America support gay marriage. Overwhelmingly, like something like 80-something%. It's a done deal. Even in the religious community and even in Orthodoxy, they're working on how can they be more welcoming and accommodating, and they're struggling with it. But certainly conservative movement, reform, reconstructionist, renewal are all embracing of LGBTQ. The difference between them and us is the rationale. So we are in alliance with that liberal Jewish community in their approach, but we get to say, honestly, our ancestors got it wrong. We can just say that the lines in the Torah, and by the way, these Christian extremists who are anti-LGBTQ are not quoting the New Testament, they're quoting our Jewish Bible to discriminate against LGBTQ without consulting the source people who say that's not accurate, that's not correct. We don't see it as a quote unquote abomination. And what happens in Reform Judaism and the other liberal denominations is they backfill in the embrace of LGBTQ into the religion. So what I commonly hear said is, because we were all created in the image of God, right? You may know that line from the Torah, and that's been the thing that the liberal religious Jewish community has grasped onto. Well, if we're all created in the image of God, then how can a trans person be an abomination? Because that too is the image of God, right? In humanistic Judaism, we can say, no, God was created in the image of man because man created God, and we don't need to backfill the story. We can just say that the line in the Torah that's being used, that's being weaponized against LGBTQ, is a Bronze Age morality that we reject. Morality has evolved, and we have evolved as a people, and we can simply say there were a lot of things that our ancestors were right about, and we can learn from them still. And then there were a lot of things that they were wrong about, and we can disagree with them and not have to say, oh, well, hey, this was in the religion all along. It wasn't. The Jewish community changed. All of those other denominations I just mentioned did not ordain gay or lesbian rabbis until my own lifetime, right? So when they're saying, oh, the Bible says this, and so therefore we're welcoming, you yourselves interpreted the Bible differently literally 30 years ago, right? I'm old enough to remember that. So don't say that this was with us all along and that, suddenly we've discovered we've been interpreting it all wrong. No, let's just be honest about it. They got it wrong. We fixed it, right? So I think that this philosophy of adding humanism into Jewish cultural identity allows us to do a lot of things differently, and maybe, hopefully, refreshingly for a lot of Jews who had walked away from organized religion because they were desperately trying to say exactly these things and were shut down by, frankly, a religious establishment who wanted to maintain a very clear religious tie to the past. So the final thing that I will say is that, recognizing that I'm speaking to a group of people who may be coming from many different backgrounds, Jews have been secularized and secularizing for literally a couple of hundred years now. The trend is growing in America in general for people of other religious backgrounds. And I would like to think that there may be some lessons on what to do and what not to do that we could be of help in sharing. But certainly, I think approaching rather than completely rejecting a religious heritage, approaching it by saying, what might I still take with me that's of value? We just came out of the December holidays. I know countless openly secular, former or raised Christian people who still have a Christmas tree, who still celebrate Christmas, because it is completely cultural. And the joke of the angry sentiments about putting the Christ back into Christmas is a reaction to the fact that Christmas is overwhelmingly a secular holiday. And of course, the folks who know the history of it know that it's of pagan origin to begin with. So they don't buy into that whole putting Christ back into Christmas anyway. But my point is that lapsed Catholics or former Christians don't have to necessarily throw out the baby with the bathwater if they find meaning and value in celebrating their connection or tradition through ritual, right? Putting up a Christmas tree is an annual ritual. There may not be a prayer associated with it, but it's a ritual and it brings meaning and it brings connection. And I say, do it if it's going to be meaningful and not hurt anybody. So I think that the bright secular future that I wish on all of us doesn't necessarily mean we have to leave behind our heritage or our culture or the things that we value. We can bring it with us. I just want to be able to speak openly about why are we still doing this? What is the meaning here? And what are the pieces that we are openly rejecting as well, because those are negative or unhelpful. And once I think we can do that, it also opens it up for everybody to enjoy and celebrate. And certainly in our movement, we've engaged many people who have no genetic connection to Judaism, but it resonates with them. And we say, welcome. If the idea of Shabbat brings you meaning, Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, where you're supposed to take a break, a clean break from your work week, that has science behind it. The benefits are clear to separating yourself from the week. And we don't need to incorporate religion or prayer to recognize that as a practice, as a ritual, there may be great benefits. Similarly to meditation or yoga, which both in many cases emerge out of Buddhist religion. Buddhists in India and Japan do have a pantheon of gods, and some Buddhists pray to those gods, but most Buddhists in America and people who use those practices like yoga and meditation have completely removed the theistic pieces of it to recognize that, oh, there's a practice here that is of benefit. And why would I have to reject that piece just because it originated out of theistic religion? So that's where I am on it. But I'm happy to hear where other folks are and what your thoughts are on it. I saw some movement in the chat. I'll try to go back and read it now. But I guess, first of all, thank you so much for letting me talk. And also, I'm happy to hear your thoughts and answer your questions and get some reactions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for giving this talk and for making it very personal and giving us a deeper connection of understanding about humanistic Judaism. I will open the floor now to people to raise their hand or just to ask questions.
I have a question to ask you, Paul.
Shoot.
Could you explain the concept of a personal God? A personal God.
My understanding of it is that God hears you personally, individually. Is that your understanding of it?
When I think of a personal God, I think of, first of all, a God who looks like me, who has arms, legs, a body, a head.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And this is a personal God, and I'm not sure other people share this God with me. This is the way I read the Bible. This is the way I act. And this is a personal God to me. I don't know what other people are doing.
Right. So when I talked about the Pew question, do you believe in the God of the Bible? I mentioned that they don't define.
Yeah, but it's a personal God. It's not, everybody don't believe the God in the Bible. There's many variations. The God has 70 names in the Bible.
Right.
There's 70 names, and people look at the Bible and the stories of Abraham, Isaac differently.
Right.
They interpret it differently, what God did or didn't do.
Right. And I think that that's both a great challenge, but also I think it's one of the really interesting and beautiful things about Judaism, quite frankly, is that they didn't want to nail it down because they didn't know. It was like an acknowledgement that we don't really know. We can't really know, right? And that is, I think, dramatically different than the statement of we know, or that, frankly, I don't want to put down anyone's belief, but that God became a man, and here's what he looked like. Turns out he was a Middle Easterner with blonde hair and blue eyes, but okay. And, that's who we're going to focus our prayers toward, right? Judaism is much more abstract. And that's something that I really appreciate. And I think it did open the door to a lot of different interpretations and a lot of secular interpretations as well. So when you say personal God, I think of it a little differently, which is a God who reacts and is involved in your life versus an impersonal God, right? I think that the contrast is there, and the impersonal God is like Einstein's watchmaker, right? A God that set the universe in motion and then step back and then everything happens, right? Or an impersonal God, which is the forces of nature and a supernatural force, but doesn't really care so much about what happens to you personally, right? So that's how I see it.
Well,
but I appreciate your question, because I do think it's complicated.
I think the key is, of course, the commandments. I mean, God said, don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery.
Which God?
My personal God
Okay.
told me, here are 10 commandments.
Would you be doing those things if God hadn't told you not to?
No, if he said, don't kill people, I don't kill people.
What if he didn't tell you that? Would you be killing people?
I think I would not be killing people.
Right. So that's kind of the humanistic approach.
Kill people.
Right. So that's humanism, which is that we know that killing people is wrong, and we know it because we're human, and it's inherent. There's, murder is bad is in every human society, right? Whether you believe in one God or 100,000 gods, it's a pretty common human experience to say murder is bad. So I think that's the humanistic approach, is we didn't need a God to do it. So I see Noah, then David, then Linda. So Noah.
Hi, sorry. I've got my son here, and we've talked about bar mitzvah for many years, and I'm curious to hear what bar mitzvah looks like. I was raised Orthodox till I was 7 years old in South Africa. So what does bar mitzvah look like? Does it make any sense? Do we like that idea?
Yes, thank you so much. Great question. I think we have an exciting answer, which is it is what we will help make it meaningful for you, but you help decide it. So there's multiple answers. As I said, we have 26 communities in North America, and in the organized communities, they have a bit of a structure. Each structure has a degree of flexibility within it. But to compare it to your Orthodox bar mitzvah, there is no Torah reading if you don't want Torah reading. There is no rote memorization if you don't want rote memorization. I think even if you want rote memorization, I'm not sure that our communities would accommodate that. I grew up in the conservative movement, which is like one step down from orthodoxy, but I did not enjoy my bar mitzvah experience because it was mostly in Hebrew, which I don't understand. By the way, only about 10% of US Jews understand Hebrew. If you go into any other denomination, including ours, frankly, we do have some songs in Hebrew, and you've never been to a Jewish service before, you would presume everyone here understands Hebrew, when in reality, most people don't understand it. And so I felt like my bar mitzvah was basically memorizing a bad song in a language I don't understand. And I am not going to do that to my kids. So that's within our communities, there is some structure, but basically in most of our communities, the student chooses a hero or a project, like a family research project, something related to Judaism that they choose, and then they present on it, as well as leading a community in some kind of ritual services. I'll give you an example. One of our board members here in New York City is married to a lapsed Irish Catholic with family still in Ireland. So this young person here in New York did their bar mitzvah on Irish Jews of Ireland, right? And did a whole research and a whole presentation. And that was a meaningful connection, not just for his Jewish side of the family, but for the Irish side of the family as well. So that's the opportunities there. We also have a program of remote learning for people who are not near one of our 26 communities. And it's basically, you can work with a tutor or you can do this self-learning program. And again, there's learning about history and ethics, but also so much of it is determined by what your interests are, because frankly, if you give me any subject, I can connect it to Judaism or Jewish culture, right? Even if it's like ice hockey, I'll make the connection. So that's where we go with B'nai Mitzvah, and it's not like a 3-year requirement or anything like that. You can do it in a year. Some people do it in less, but there is a course of study. I'm not going to say, it's a one afternoon commitment, but our goal is about meaning in anything that we do. And that was not the case when I was growing up. The goal for my community was make me a good synagogue citizen, make me know how to do the prayer service at a conservative synagogue, which I knew by age 11 was not a skill I was ever going to need, right? So that's where we go on bar mitzvah, but it's also our approach on pretty much everything we do, which is what is going to be the meaning here that we can pull out of it for the individual. So thank you so much for that question. I see David and then Linda. David.
I just wanted to start off by saying that I can relate very much to what you've just described, because I am raised as a Reformed Jew, and I sent my kids to temple, and they had their bat mitzvahs, and all that time I was agnostic, basically. So what you're describing interests me, and I'm wondering, first of all, how would I find it? What do I Google? And what's the closest one to to the South?
SHJ.org, Society for Humanistic Judaism.org. If you're on Facebook, we have a very active discussion group with about, I think like 1,800 people now at Humanistic Judaism discussion. If you search that on Facebook and join that group, and on shj.org, sign up for our occasional emails. We really don't bombard you with emails, but we try to make sure that each are filled with content. And that's probably the best way to do it, is to just start poking around on our website. But thank you, because I really appreciate it. And you are exactly who we're trying to reach, and at least let people know that this option is available to them. Linda.
Hi. Hi, Paul. I'm Lindy Sinclair, and I'm the president of Kol Hadash of Northern California.
Hi.
And born Jewish, both my parents were Jewish, but in rebellion against being forced to attend synagogue and do all the rituals, they didn't want to do anything. And I didn't learn about Judaism until I got to America. And now I'm the president of a congregation, and I don't know what to do. So I'm wondering, other than being a moral compass and talking about being good to each other, is there any actual training for what I'm trying to do?
Absolutely. And I look forward to being in touch with you directly, because that's really the role that we take at Society for Humanistic Judaism, is to support local in-person communities, both those that exist already and those that want to start anew. I'm sorry, David, one of your questions was what exists in the South. And we don't really have a strong presence outside of Florida, which I don't know whether you fully consider the South or not. But the Jewish coastal regions are not necessarily the South, but we have some interested people in Atlanta, but they haven't really been able to get a community off the ground. We'd love to have a community there. Look, the challenge, and Lindy, you're probably experiencing some of this, is the model that was set up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and it worked then by Rabbi Sherman Wein, was the congregational denomination model. And that's not working out for anybody. It's not working for Reform Judaism, which is below peak. All the liberal denominations in all religions are below peak members, because that's not how people want to join things anymore. We're not giving up on that. We're trying to strengthen it, but at the same time, we're also looking for other avenues of engagement. Social justice is a key component in how liberal Jews express their Jewish identity. So one project we have, which is a separate website, is Jews for a Secular Democracy. And this is pluralistic. It's not just humanistic Jews. It's for all Jews who want to see religion out of government, period. That the government of the United States was supposed to be secular and not influenced by one religion over another. And this affects all kinds of issues that we care about, like LGBTQ equality, women's equality, and prayer in school, all kinds of stuff that's now being assaulted. Abortion was overturned last year, Roe v. Wade. So all of these issues relate to religious understandings of the world that we don't think our government should be litigating about. Miriam just put in the chat, jfasd.org is the website for that, Jews for Secular Democracy. So that's one avenue, but we're looking for other avenues. You know, bar mitzvah came up. I think b'nai mitzvah or b mitzvah, we call it cultural b mitzvah. B is gender neutral. Cultural b mitzvah, we think, is a great avenue because people inherently understand the value of coming of age ceremonies, right? They don't inherently understand the value of a congregational membership. right? But we don't need that to do cultural bar mitzvah. So we're going to try to bypass that model for those who are not near an in-person community, but still want that value. So that's another avenue. And we continue to look for these additional avenues, even as we also think high holidays, Jewish high holidays, the Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, still draw people once a year to connect to their Jewish identity. Passover, Hanukkah, those are events that we should still be doing and be doing in bigger ways in the community, because we have something different to say than the rest of the Jewish community. James and is it
Thank you.
Kathy? Sure. But Lindy, please be in touch with us after this call. Hi.
One of the terms you used, Paul, was race, and you identify as white. But the interesting question, and many of you might want to Google this, when did Jews become white?
Right.
We weren't until sometime after World War II. There's a lot written about that.
Right.
The other
yeah. Go ahead.
thing I want to bring up, in this day and age, one can have dual citizenship. That's taken for granted today. However, religion is only one. And a quote from somebody who was a World War II survivor, not in the camps, but in the underground French army and resistance. His answer to the question, what religion are you? I'm Catholic, but my background is Jewish. So he accepted both, but there's no place for that in our governmental use of race in our census forms.
There is now, you can be multiracial on the census, but
But how about multi-religious?
I think you can check multiple boxes too on the census form. But let me talk about race for a minute, because Whoopi Goldberg continues to trip over this. I don't know if you've seen this or followed it, but she just did it again. It's confusing because in the early 20th century, Jews were called a race, but so were Irish, you know, and the understanding of race has changed over time, and that's okay because it's a construct to begin with anyway, but the construct has changed. So where we are today is not where we were. But yes, when Hitler came to power, Jews were a race, and they were a persecuted race. And anti-Semitism is not really a kind of racism. It's complicated. But why I call myself white, and so you mentioned the book is called When Jews Became White Folk, and it emerged out of a PhD thesis that I wish I am not blanking on this professor's name, but it's a book, if people are really interested, where this professor traces what happened to allow Jews in America to be white. And many Jews don't want to claim whiteness and won't, but I do, because I have seen how I personally have benefited from white privilege. In my youth, I was told not to do things by the police that other people could have spent jail time, and they just told me, oh, cut that out, right? Why? At the time, it didn't register until a friend of mine who didn't have white privilege pointed out to me. And I had to go through a process of recognition that, oh yeah, I guess I do have these benefits. Jews were restricted in the early 20th century on all kinds of things, as far as where they could live and how many can go to the Ivy League schools, and what hotels they could stay at. There was an equivalent of the Green Book for Jews as well. But all of that began to fade away after World War II. And for better or worse, frankly. But that's why I acknowledge my race as white. I think that that's fair to do. Not all Jews are white. And I think that that's important to recognize as well. but my ethnicity. So this is where I believe it has changed, which is that ethnicity, Jewish ethnicity, is what had been called race back in the day. And anyway, this is what I think Whoopi is getting tripped up on, and I wish she would just recognize and be able to discuss how it has changed over time. Anyway, but thank you for, Karen Brodkin, thank you for putting that in there. I read the thesis, but not the full book, but it was fascinating, and it's a fascinating history. But within one generation of my family, so I mentioned my mom was born in a displaced persons camp. She came here as a refugee, right? That makes me want to have empathy for all refugees. I want to hang on to that. But she was the first person in her family, as far as I know, to go to college. And within her generation, she's an immigrant. We were in the middle class and then the upper middle class, right? How come she was able to do that? It wasn't just because she went and got educated. There were other benefits. I don't feel like you can talk about that in America without acknowledging race and racial discrimination. So that's why I brought that up. But thank you. Robin.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out exactly, how kids are raised as humanistic Jews. I mean, I guess my question really is that if you're not technically following Torah as the law, because Torah is the Jewish law, what values do you teach children? I mean, in lieu of the Torah or the.
Right. So we do still look at the Torah. One of the innovations that Rabbi Sherwin did when he built the Birmingham Temple out in suburban Detroit, when you go into, if you ever get a chance to visit, and I recommend it, there are many things that feel like walking into a suburban synagogue. But when you walk into the sanctuary, there is no ark at the center with a Torah. They have a Torah. The Torah is in the library. And it was because he said, this is a book. It's a very important book. It has a lot of meaning to Jewish history, but it's a book, and we're going to put it in the library. And we're not going to put it in a place of reverence in our sanctuary. So that kind of touches on the philosophy of our approach to Torah, which is it's part of our history. There is some fascinating stuff in there. There is some ethical values that emerge from Torah that are still very relevant to our lives today. But we are going to consciously acknowledge which of them they are and which we reject. And honestly, that's happening in all the Jewish denominations. They're just not saying so, right? Certainly outside of Orthodoxy. And there's a phrase that I think the Reconstructionist movement uses that says, Torah gets a vote, not a veto. I mean, it's like, there's all kinds of different approaches outside of Orthodoxy about what we do and don't do. But look, again, only about 15% of all US Jews keep kosher. And humanistic Jews are only like 2%. So that means a huge swath of Jews are picking and choosing what they find meaningful. And we just do the same thing. Now, what we do differently is we also overlay a whole other value set, which is humanism. So we value logic, right? We value science, and we want to incorporate that into our ethical values. So I think that's an advantage and a benefit, but we don't say, oh, well, no, we're not even going to look at the Torah because it's all baloney. It's part of our heritage, and there's a lot of stuff that is meaningful, and not just the Torah, but the Talmud. The Talmud is the commentary on the Torah, and it's a 1,000-year conversation between some of the smartest people who were alive at that time. And it's an argument and a debate. There's rarely agreement. And the thing that I love about it is they record the losing arguments because one day they may be the winning arguments, right? There's an understanding that this is a negotiation. And so we see ourselves as part of that tradition of negotiating how how humans walk through life as good people. And what we're doing is bringing into that conversation, humanism, which is, I think, when I first learned of that word, very late into adulthood, it was like, oh, there's a word for what I was already believing for as long as I could remember, right? Judge everyone as an equal, rejection of God's chosen people, right? Like Reconstructionist movement has openly rejected chosenness. Conservative hasn't. So, I feel like we're just in conversation with that as well. But we do raise our kids with like the best of both worlds, is what I would argue.
So you don't have just a follow through. So you don't have Torah scrolls then.
Some of our communities, like the Birmingham Temple, has a Torah scroll, an actual physical Torah.
Okay.
But what we don't do is march it around and kiss it, as I grew up doing, and maybe many of you have as well. First of all, you dress it, right? It's got a fancy outfit with crowns on it and jewelry. It has more jewelry than my mom. And you march it around the Torah, and everybody, you don't touch it directly. You kiss your prayer shawl or your book, and you touch it. Even as a kid, I'm like, wait, is this God? Is this the thing that we're worshiping? And again, I get the argument, oh, this is metaphor. Okay. But you know what? It's a book. And I love that Sherwan's approach was, this is a book. It's a really important book. It's a book, and we can acknowledge who wrote it. And we can talk about what it says, but let's not raise this up as, and I saw one of the questions in the chat was about Jewish law. And that
Probably me.
Yeah, it's like, where does that law originate from? And if you acknowledge that that law originates from men, then it's in constant negotiation, just like civil law, about what is and isn't just. But I do feel like Judaism has an emphasis on justice that is worth retaining and growing and exploring. And I feel like many secular Jews are still fired by the notion of justice. And I want to tap into that and continue that.
Thank you.
Sure. I don't see any other hands. Anyone else want to chime in? Unmute, put your hand up, anything?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Your denomination has been around since the end of the 60s. Humanism has been around since what? Early formations, 1920s, 30s, 40s, around there. And so I see your tradition as being, there's a lot more room for it being dynamic and growing and learning. Are there any conflicts along the way that you have seen? And is this still a tradition that is growing, or am I wrong in assuming that?
Great question. I think that a huge number of American Jews, were they to read our definition of a humanistic Jew, would say, and I've had this experience myself many times because I get to talk about this immediately, because one of the most common questions when you meet someone in America is, oh, what do you do? And I can't just leave it at executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and then not get a follow-up question, right? It's not like being, oh, I'm a pulmonary medical doctor, which I'm sure my mom would have preferred. But anyway, so I immediately get to talk about humanistic Judaism. And when I say this to people who grew up Jewish, I often hear a double whammy of, oh, yeah, that kind of describes how I feel. I've never heard of you guys before, right? So it's like, yay, and then, ooh. And so one of the things we're trying to do is just spread the word. But the other, and frankly, I feel like if my job, if I could get more Jews just to know the word humanism and what it means, I would have created more humanistic Jews, because it's almost like, oh yeah, of course. But the other challenge I mentioned, which is, how do you align yourself now with humanistic Jews? And you may have experienced this organizing secular people in general, which I've heard compared to like herding cats. in the Jewish community, we say herding cats, K-A-T-Z is how we would spell the cats, but okay. Sorry,
Right.
bad Jewish joke. But secular people have, in many ways, led the movement away from organized community. But this is a trend, you know, that the book Bowling Alone came out like 30 years ago. It's happening in America. There's also a corresponding loneliness pandemic, which was being said before there was an actual health pandemic. But, you know, I think we're making a countercultural argument in saying community is valuable also. And that's an uphill battle today compared to in years past when people were just joiners. I think secular people in particular are not necessarily joiners. So that's why what we've been working on is giving away a significant percentage of the meaning, like growing our web presence, growing our Facebook presence, and so on, and just giving it to people. And then hoping that for some of them who are really moved by it, that they will then take on an additional level of either membership or support or creating community of their own, becoming a leader, and so on. And so I kind of think of it in terms of concentric circles, and we just haven't reached a big enough outer circle yet and engaged enough people, but we're working on it. And the good news is, I feel, certainly when I look at studies like the Pew survey, we have a huge swath of people that we can still reach that we haven't reached yet. And that's why, like, opportunities like tonight I really appreciate being able to meet anyone who, you know, is hearing about this for the first time and kind of says, as I did, oh yeah, that kind of describes how I feel, and I'm glad to know you folks exist. And that's great. And that's certainly all I can ask for as a first step. And then if you want to dig deeper, we're here to help you. Barbara.
You mentioned that the movement is having trouble growing, and that's a tendency away from community generally in the country. And yet I read recently, either in the Times or in a local paper, that the Hasidics are growing faster than any other group in the world, maybe, or at least in the Jewish community. So what is their pull? What are they doing that's right or wrong?
So for those who don't know, Hasidic Judaism is a kind of ultra-Orthodoxy. It's one of the sects of ultra-Orthodoxy, and they wear like traditional all black outfits you may have seen. And so I was very careful when I said all liberal religious denominations are in decline, but conservative and especially fanatical religion is still doing great. And I think a piece of it is the certainty with which they can promise their adherence. But something else is happening in Hasidic Judaism, though, that we should acknowledge, which is an incredibly high birth rate combined with a lack of education to allow anybody to be able to leave on their own, because they can't, this is happening, this is playing out in particularly in the New York City area. They're not learning secular subjects like English and science and math. So they come out of high school with a thick Yiddish accent. They don't know how to read and write Hebrew above a 4th grade level, and they can't get a job even if they want to leave their community. So I don't know how long that can sustain itself, but that's not a model that I'm eager to emulate, even if we could. We have to go by the meaning. You know, we have to lead with the meaning, and if it's meaningful for people, all we can do is ask them to join us, be a part of our movement, support us, and so on. That is coercion, and it's forced, and I'm actually very against it and very dismayed by that approach. So that's not who I'm able to look at as a model, unfortunately. And we are concerned. And I mentioned our Jews for a Secular Democracy initiative. We're actually partnered with a group here in New York called YAFFED, YAFFED, which is the leading advocacy organization against these Jewish day schools, yeshivas, that are not teaching secular subjects. And we're trying to change that. So at least people have an option when they grow up to be able to engage in the wider US community. Welcome, Eva. I have to introduce Eva as one of our movement rabbis and someone who just received earlier or at the end of last year our Sherwin Wine Award for Lifetime Achievement. So this is when I mentioned that there are people on this call who know way more than I do. Here's one of them. So sorry to embarrass you, Eva, but I have to give the context.
Thanks, Paul. I have a question because you brought up a couple of times the growth issue and how important community is. So in the mental health department, we are noticing a dramatic increase in mental health issues, a lot of which is being blamed on overuse of technology, you know, where you see 5 kids together and they're each standing there with their cell phones and they think that they're talking to each other, but they're actually not communing, which is the root word for community. So we need to recognize that if this continues, we are going to see dramatic increases, even more than we see now, and how important it is for us to note that in our growth potentials and in our promotions for growing. Do you see that as a possibility of showing, of continuing to put things on our website and so on and put out talking pods, whatever they're called? Can't even think of the name right now. Podcasts about the importance of social interaction, literal social interaction, and how in Humanistic Judaism we promote that very strongly. Can you see this as a marketing tool?
I think it's great. I mean, I think we have to be careful about what we are promising people, you know, especially around mental health. I know that some of our rabbis actually are mental health practitioners, but I'm not. But we're not offering mental health services, but community can help. And I mentioned the loneliness epidemic. I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, and someone, if you could mute yourself because I'm hearing some feedback, but if you're, because, you know, I come from a marketing background as well. And so a piece of this is marketing. And so, yes, I do think that we can address this, but I think we have to, and I just don't have the answers of exactly what the right language is, because I also don't want to be SHJ, the Lonely Hearts Club. If you are a miserable cur, please join us and meet with other miserable curs. No, like we can't say that, right? If you have alienated every person in your life, come join our wonderful, loving community, right? So you have to figure out how to do this correctly. But I think it's something that we should be working on, and I appreciate the reminder, because I'm always thinking about meaning and value. And to me, one of the biggest values is coming together with other like-minded people. And one of the things that I hear a lot from folks is, I thought I was the only one, right? You know, I thought I grew up in a Jewish community, and this happened to me as well in my conservative Jewish community. I had nobody to talk to. I recognized that I was atheist about the God of the Bible by age 11, and I was still going through this Jewish education, and there was nobody approachable, the rabbi or anybody who I could talk to about this. That's not every community, but certainly in many communities, there's nobody that you can talk to about this. And certainly that's one thing that we should be putting out there, is you're not alone if you feel this way. There's a whole community of people. I do think that's why even though you told me not to praise the technology, the one benefit though of that Facebook group in Humanistic Judaism is people from all over the planet are connecting around issues where they feel like they have nobody in their physical proximity that they can talk to about this, but they do have an online community of other people who feel the same way. So again, double-edged sword, but yes, absolutely, we should be putting that out there more. And if you want to write a blog entry about it, we'll post it. So please do that. Thank you. I know Sean wanted to kind of keep this to 90 minutes, and I don't see any other hands up, but we have like an opportunity to take one more quick question or comment. Otherwise, I want to thank you all so much for
May I say
Yes.
something? May I
Sure.
say something? I don't want to talk too much. I very much appreciated everything you said, and relate to most of it. I used to, as a parent, I think that I was a hypocritical Jew, and I kind of made my kids, go to temple, even though I was not raised formally as a Jew. I was raised culturally as a Jew. And I wanted them to have an understanding of what they could reject when they got older, if that makes any sense. But I loved your distinctions of, cultural, ethnically, culinarily, because those are so many things that I think that we embrace. And, when we had to bury a loved one, we sat shiva, which I found a very comforting tradition. And I've been to many, wakes and other types of ceremonies for passing. But then I became, I guess I wish there was something that I knew of that was a different substitute for bar and bar mitzvah. Because I felt obliged, not living in New York City any longer, I felt obliged to give the kids an identity because we were such a minority. And, I will also own being white, because when you see me, that is what you see. But I also feel like I am an invisible minority, and I do very much relate and embrace the gift that being a minority has given me, the compassion for. So
what you are saying, first of all, you're absolutely not alone in that. I think that's happening in so many places because they don't know that there's another option. And so I really appreciate hearing that. I think that was the case in my own family. I mentioned how miserable my bar mitzvah prep experience was and going to Hebrew school. And the moment, I think the only theological conversation really that I had with my mom was when I was so fed up. I was 12 and I said, I thought I was going to drop this big bombshell on her when I said, I'm not having a bar mitzvah because I don't believe in God. And she said, well, I don't either, and you're having a bar mitzvah. So that's how I recognize that I am at least second generation, probably third generation atheist Jew. And she was doing exactly what you were describing, because she also didn't know, and I didn't know, that there was this other option happening out in suburban Michigan that would have allowed us to not feel hypocritical about the words we were saying. And I want to also acknowledge my colleague, Miriam Jarris, who's on with us now and is the rabbi at SHJ. And my first week on the job, I went to see her speak at our community in Connecticut, in Fairfield County, Connecticut. And one of the analogies she asked was, in what other realm do you force your kid to do something in the hopes that they will reject it? Do you give them piano lessons in the hope that they hate piano? No, of course not. So why would you do that, right? And I thought that that was just so clear. But I do understand when you don't think there's any other option, that you're like, well, I went through it. Now I'm a cultural Jew. Maybe this is the way that you create cultural Jews. But thank you for that. And I'm glad that we are now working on providing this kind of alternative way to do it, where you can feel like you get to say what you really believe. Here's the thing, though, your kids can still reject you. Your kids may end up Haredi, right? If that's the route that they find meaningful, and or they're rebelling against your secularity. It happens. But I'm willing to take that risk because I want my kids to see that I'm being true to what I believe.
or don't
Thank
believe.
you again, everybody. Right, or don't believe. We try to lead with the belief, but I also want to acknowledge what we don't believe. So thanks, everybody. I'll turn it back to Sean if you have anything closing and you're still here.
Again, thank you again, Paul, for presenting this, and the questions have been great. I thank everyone for attending this talk. Hopefully it was interesting and meaningful for everyone. And I wish everyone a good evening and a good night.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Cheerio.
Thank you.
See everyone.
I thank him on your behalf.